"You're just another black nobody," Officer Morrison sneered, convinced he held all the power, that Jamal was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. They ripped him from the car, slammed him against the hood, and cuffed him, seeing no risk, no threat, just another routine display of unchecked authority. But this time, things wouldn't go as they expected. Because Jamal Carter was no ordinary man, he was a federal judge. And when he raised his phone, it wasn't to plead, it was to press record. By the time they realized who he was, their downfall had already begun. Justice was coming, and they would be the ones in cuffs next. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Jamal Carter adjusted his tie with one hand as he steered his sleek black Mercedes down the familiar stretch of road, his mind already racing ahead to the meeting he was running late for. The weight of the morning still lingered on his shoulders. A flurry of paperwork, back-to-back hearings, and a quick phone call with his wife, Vanessa, reminding him not to skip lunch again. But amid the rush of his schedule, it was only now, as he reached for his wallet to pay for parking, that he realized it wasn't there. His fingers brushed against nothing but the smooth lining of his suit jacket. He exhaled sharply, glancing down for just a fraction of a second before easing his foot off the gas. His mind traced back through the morning, the hurried routine, the coffee cup he left half-finished on the counter. The wallet was still at home. He slowed further, easing into the right lane, his focus shifting. He couldn't afford the delay of turning back, not when time was already against him, but the realization left him momentarily unsettled. His ID, his license, gone. Even as a federal judge, something about driving without identification gnawed at him, a quiet unease pressing into his ribs. He knew the world he lived in, knew it all too well. Then the flashing lights came. His gaze lifted to the rearview mirror, just as the piercing glow of red and blue strobes flooded the space behind him. His heartbeat remained steady, but a familiar tension crept into his spine, an old instinct carved into him from experiences that stretched long before he ever stepped foot in a courtroom. He signaled immediately, pulling over to the side of the road with practiced precision, each motion careful, deliberate. He reached for the glove compartment, retrieving his car's registration and insurance, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the documents. Through the mirror, he watched as two figures emerged from the patrol car, both white, both moving with the same air of practiced authority, the same deliberate slowness that was meant to unnerve. The taller one, broad-shouldered with graying hair just peeking from beneath his cap, adjusted his belt as he approached. His partner, younger, but with a face set in something hard, followed a step behind. Jamal exhaled quietly through his nose, keeping his hands visible as they approached, fingers lightly resting on the wheel. He could already feel it coming. The tone, the scrutiny, the unnecessary prolonging of what should have been a brief exchange. The older officer, his nameplate reading Reed, leaned in first, peering into the car with narrowed eyes, the flicker of something cautious, suspicious, barely hidden beneath the professional mask. "You in a hurry, sir?" His voice was slow, measured, but there was no politeness behind it. Jamal met his gaze evenly, his own tone calm but firm. "Not particularly, officer. Is there a reason I was pulled over?" Reed didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his gaze drift, scanning the interior of the vehicle as though expecting to find something out of place. His partner, Morrison, lingered just behind him, hand resting on his holster. Not drawing, but resting, just enough to send a message. Jamal knew this game. He had seen it play out 1,000 times, not just in courtrooms, but in the streets, in hushed conversations, in the testimonies of men who had been on the other side of encounters just like this. Reed finally let out a hum, tilting his head slightly. "You slowed down real sudden back there. Looked like you were trying to avoid something." Jamal let the words settle for a beat before responding. Measured. "I realized I left my wallet at home. I was considering my next move." Reed's lips pressed together, as if unconvinced. Morrison shifted slightly, stepping closer, his presence radiating quiet antagonism. "No license, then?" Morrison's voice was sharper, the first hint of a smirk ghosting the edges of his expression, as though he had just uncovered something of interest. Jamal forced himself to remain relaxed, even as irritation curled at the edges of his patience. "No, but I do have my registration and insurance right here." He lifted the documents just slightly. An offering, a courtesy. Reed didn't take them. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, exchanging a glance with Morrison before shaking his head slightly, almost like he was amused. "That's so?" Jamal waited, letting them play their hand first. "You see," Reed continued, his stance shifting slightly, as if settling into the role he had played far too many times before, "this here's a nice car. Real nice. And you're telling me you just happened to be driving around without ID?" There it was. Jamal didn't react immediately. He had spent years in courtrooms dismantling arguments flimsier than this. But there was no judge here but them, no jury but the power they held in the moment. He chose his words carefully. "I believe my registration and insurance should be more than sufficient to verify ownership." Reed let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Morrison's smirk widened slightly, as though he had been waiting for just this response. "You'd think," Morrison mused, stepping just a fraction closer. "But thing is, we get a lot of folks in stolen vehicles who say the same thing. Just a little too convenient, you know?" Jamal's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he kept his voice even. "Are you accusing me of stealing my own car, officer?" Reed let the question hang for a moment, before shrugging, casual. "Just saying it's a little suspect." Jamal exhaled, slow and measured, as though releasing the pressure building in his chest. He knew where this was headed, knew that his credentials, his profession, his standing in the justice system, none of it mattered right now. Right now, to them, he was just a black man in a car that they had decided was too nice for him. Reed tapped the roof of the Mercedes twice, before stepping back slightly. "Go ahead and step out of the vehicle for me, sir." The words settled between them like a shifting weight, pressing, suffocating. Jamal didn't move immediately. He held Reed's gaze for a fraction longer than was probably wise, considering his options, considering the inevitability of what was to come. Then, slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. Jamal stepped onto the pavement, the warmth of the afternoon sun doing little to ease the cold press of unease settling in his chest. He had been through this routine before, had heard the stories, had seen them play out in courtrooms where words like probable cause and reasonable suspicion twisted and turned in the hands of those who wielded them as shields, deflecting accountability while justifying every injustice. Reed stepped in closer, his presence a deliberate encroachment of space, his expression unreadable except for the faint hint of satisfaction lurking beneath the professional mask. Morrison lingered just behind him, still near the car, eyes sharp and assessing, scanning the interior with a slow, methodical sweep, as though already crafting the excuse they would need to prolong this stop. "Turn around, hands on the hood," Reed instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument, though it was layered with something almost taunting, a challenge disguised as procedure. Jamal didn't react immediately, keeping his expression carefully neutral, even as he weighed the futility of any protest. He had seen men argue their innocence, their voices tight with frustration, only to be met with escalating aggression, an unspoken warning that non-compliance, however justified, would not be tolerated. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and placed his hands against the cool metal of his car's hood, feeling the weight of their scrutiny press into his back before their hands ever did. Reed patted him down with a practiced roughness, his touch impersonal yet invasive, an assertion of power rather than a search conducted with any genuine purpose. His hands dragged over Jamal's arms, down his torso, pausing at the pockets of his slacks before moving lower, tapping against his ankles as though expecting, hoping, to find something that would justify what they were doing. Jamal exhaled slowly, his patience stretched thin but intact, the muscles in his jaw tightening only slightly. "I trust you've satisfied your concerns, officer." His voice was steady, but the undertone was clear. Reed let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly as he stepped back. "Oh, we're just getting started." He glanced toward Morrison, who was now fully engaged in his own inspection of the vehicle, pulling open the glove compartment without waiting for permission, rifling through its contents with slow, deliberate movements. Jamal turned his head slightly, watching as Morrison lifted a few documents, skimming them before tossing them back carelessly. "You don't seem too concerned about handling someone else's property with respect," he remarked, his voice still calm, though there was an edge now, subtle but unmistakable. Morrison didn't even look up. "Respect's earned," he muttered, flipping down the sun visor as if expecting contraband to tumble out onto his lap. Jamal let out a slow breath through his nose, keeping his hands where they were as he turned his gaze back toward Reed, who was watching him with something that could have been amusement, or something far more calculated. "So, tell me something, Judge." Reed drew out the title with a faint smirk, as though the word itself was amusing, as though it didn't quite belong to him. "That your car? Or you just borrowing it?" Jamal didn't so much as blink. "It's mine." Reed hummed, as if considering, glancing back at Morrison, who was now in the back seat, shifting through the compartments with the same slow, infuriating thoroughness. "Sure about that? 'Cause I gotta say, it's a real nice ride. Clean, expensive, and here you are, driving around with no ID, acting all nervous." Jamal forced himself to stay still, to let the words settle before responding. "If I were nervous, officer, it would only be because I know how these stops tend to end." Reed let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head, as if that was the most ridiculous thing he'd heard all day. "Oh, come on now. Ain't no reason to be dramatic. We're just doing our job. Routine stop. You fit the description." Jamal turned his head slightly, lifting a brow. "That's so. And what description would that be?" Reed shrugged, a deliberate show of indifference. "Black male. Late 30s. Suspicious behavior." Jamal's lips pressed together, his patience thinning to the point of fraying. "Suspicious behavior like slowing down to check my wallet? Or suspicious behavior like existing?" Morrison scoffed from where he was crouched near the back seat. "Attitude like that's not gonna help you, pal." Jamal exhaled slowly, staring straight ahead, fingers curling slightly against the hood of his car before forcing them to relax. "Am I being detained? Or am I free to go?" Reed took his time answering, stretching out the pause, reveling in the control he held over the moment. "You're being cooperative," he mused, tilting his head. "That's good. Real good. But see, we got a problem. You say this car's yours, but you got no ID to prove it. You say you're a judge. But well, that's a mighty big claim for a man who ain't carrying anything to back it up. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds a little suspect, don't it?" Jamal remained silent for a long moment, swallowing back the bitter taste of frustration that clawed at the back of his throat. He knew what they were doing, knew that this was a slow, deliberate attempt to push him, to get a reaction, to turn the situation into something they could control. "You have my registration," he finally said, voice smooth, carefully measured. "That should be more than enough to verify ownership." Reed exchanged a glance with Morrison before letting out another chuckle, stepping back slightly, hands resting easily on his belt. "Yeah, see? Thing is, sometimes folks get real creative with paperwork, and this whole situation just ain't sitting right with me. So, how about this? We take a little ride down to the station, clear this up proper." The words settled between them, heavy and inevitable. Jamal closed his eyes briefly, inhaled deeply through his nose, then straightened, turning fully to face them. "I know my rights, officer. I am not under arrest. And unless you have probable cause, actual probable cause, you have no legal grounds to detain me." Reed's smirk didn't waver. "Well, see, that's the beauty of it. Right now, all we got's a little suspicion. But the good news is, we got all the time in the world to figure out whether or not there's more to this story. Morrison stepped closer, rolling his shoulders. So, how about you come with us, and we sort this out like gentlemen? Jamal knew then that it didn't matter what he said. Didn't matter how much he invoked the law. Didn't matter that he had spent years upholding the very system they were now twisting against him. They had already made their decision. And so, with his jaw tight and his composure carefully, meticulously intact, he nodded once and let them take him. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into Jamal's wrists as he settled into the back of the squad car. The plastic seat unforgiving beneath him. The partition between him and the officers a stark, deliberate divide. The door had slammed shut with a finality that settled into his chest. Heavy, but not unfamiliar. He had known where this was heading long before they had uttered the words, long before the smug exchange of glances, long before they even placed their hands on him. The engine rumbled beneath them as the patrol car pulled away from the curb, merging back into traffic like nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. Like this wasn't another routine stop turned something else entirely. Outside, the city moved on, pedestrians strolling along sidewalks, cars shifting lanes, storefronts casting reflections in the sunlight. It was all so painfully normal, a contrast to the tight, confined space in which he now sat, his hands bound, his freedom stripped, his identity, his very existence, reduced to suspicion. From the front seat, Morrison turned slightly, glancing back through the partition, his expression smug. "You know, you made this real easy for us," he mused, his voice light, conversational, like they were discussing the weather, and not the blatant abuse of authority playing out in real time. "Most guys in your position, they like to kick, scream, make a big fuss. You, though, real cooperative. Almost like you knew you were caught." Jamal didn't answer immediately. He had spent years perfecting the art of controlled silence, of measured patience, of knowing exactly when to speak and when to let men like them fill the space with their own arrogance. He stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the blurred motion of the city beyond the glass, his body still but his mind already moving, already anticipating. Reed exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he adjusted his grip on the wheel. "Yeah, I gotta say, you don't look like the usual ones we pick up. But then again, criminals are getting smarter these days. Stealing the right kind of car, wearing the right kind of suit, talking all proper. Almost convincing." Jamal's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained composed. "You ran the registration. You already know who the car belongs to." Morrison let out a low chuckle, exchanging a glance with Reed before turning back toward him. "Oh, we know who it belongs to," he said easily. "We just don't believe it's yours." Jamal remained still. "I told you." "You told us a story," Morrison interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "You expect us to believe that a federal judge?" He let out a laugh, shaking his head. "Just happens to be driving around without ID. Come on, man. You could have at least picked a lie that made sense." Reed grunted in agreement, eyes still on the road. "Real sloppy work, if you ask me. If you're gonna boost a car like this, at least have some fake credentials ready. But nah, you get pulled over, and all you got is some insurance papers and a fancy attitude." Jamal exhaled slowly, deliberately, keeping his composure intact. He had known, of course he had known, that the moment they realized the car was registered to someone with power, someone with standing, they wouldn't simply admit their mistake and let him go. That would require acknowledging that they had made a mistake at all. And that, he knew, was something they would never do. "So what's the plan?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. "You going to hold me at the station until you decide my story makes sense?" Morrison scoffed. "That depends. You tell us where you really got the car. Maybe things go a little smoother. But you want to keep up the act?" "Well, we got time." Jamal let a slow breath settle in his chest before releasing it evenly. "And what happens when you find out I am who I say I am, Reed snorted, his hands tightening briefly around the wheel before relaxing again. Yeah, see, that's the thing. You ain't. You're just another guy who got too comfortable, thought he could pull one over on us. But don't worry, we'll get the real story out of you soon enough. The patrol car slowed as they approached an intersection, the traffic light flickering red. Outside, a couple on bicycles passed in front of them, oblivious to the man sitting in the back seat, bound and accused of a crime that did not exist. Jamal stared ahead, letting their words settle, letting them believe what they wanted to believe, because he knew something they didn't. They thought they had time. They thought they had control, but time had a way of shifting the ground beneath men like them, and control was only as strong as the foundation it stood on, and soon enough, that foundation would crack beneath them. For now, he let them talk. For now, he let them believe. Because the moment they found out the truth, the real fun would begin. The patrol car slowed as it turned into the station's lot, the tires grinding against the worn pavement. The building ahead, looming under the dull wash of fluorescent lights. From the outside, it looked as unremarkable as any other precinct in the country. Faded brick, tinted windows, a revolving door of men and women funneled through its system, some leaving with their lives intact, others with their futures rewritten by a signature on a report. Jamal sat in the back, still as ever, his wrists sore from the tight grip of the cuffs, though he hadn't once let them see him wince. He refused to give them even that. Morrison stepped out first, stretching slightly before glancing back at him with that same easy smirk, as though this was nothing more than a routine drop-off, as though he already knew how the story would end. Reed followed, opening the back door with deliberate slowness, standing just close enough to emphasize the power imbalance without needing to say a word. "All right, let's go," Reed said, reaching in to grab Jamal's arm, guiding him out with just enough force to remind him who was in control. Jamal didn't resist. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply let them lead him inside, past the worn-out desk sergeant who barely looked up from his paperwork, past the lineup of men slouched on benches, waiting for their turn to be processed. The room smelled of old coffee and sweat, the sharp undercurrent of disinfectant doing little to mask the years of misery soaked into the walls. The processing desk sat near the center of the room, manned by a tired-looking officer who had clearly seen his fair share of late-night arrests, his fingers lazily clicking across the keyboard as he finished entering whatever name had come before Jamal's. Morrison stepped up first, dropping the necessary paperwork onto the desk with a casual flick of his wrist. "Got one for you," Morrison said, nodding toward Jamal as if he were an afterthought. "No ID, stolen vehicle. Probably more where that came from." The officer at the desk let out a small, disinterested hum, dragging the keyboard closer. "Name?" Morrison smirked, glancing back at Jamal. "Go on, Judge. Tell the man your name." Jamal didn't hesitate. "Jamal Carter." The officer typed it in, barely glancing up as the system processed the entry. Jamal had seen it before. The brief delay, the flicker of a loading screen, the dull flicker of light reflecting off tired eyes. He watched as the officer's posture shifted slightly, his fingers stilling for a fraction of a second before resuming their movement, a hesitation so minute that Reed and Morrison didn't even notice it. A few more keystrokes, another pause. Longer this time. Then the officer finally looked up, and this time he really looked. Jamal met his gaze, calm, patient, as the man's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze flicking toward the screen and then back to Jamal, as though his mind were trying to bridge a gap between two realities that didn't align. His fingers twitched slightly, moving the mouse, scrolling, eyes scanning line after line of text. The pause stretched. Reed shifted slightly, annoyed by the silence. "Something wrong?" The officer at the desk didn't answer right away. He licked his lips briefly, then leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only the three of them could hear. You said his name is Jamal Carter? Morrison let out a short breath, irritated. That's what he told us. You got a match or not? The officer hesitated, then turned the screen slightly. Not enough for them to see, but just enough that he could gesture toward something. Yeah, I got a match, the officer muttered. A federal match. Reed frowned, stepping closer. Federal? What the hell are you talking about? The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to phrase what was about to come next. Yeah. So, this guy, he's not just Jamal Carter. He's Judge Jamal Carter, United States Federal Court. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's smirk vanished instantly, his posture stiffening as if the weight of the realization had just knocked the wind out of him. Reed didn't move at first, his brain clearly working overtime to process what had just been said. His jaw clenching slightly, his eyes flickering between Jamal and the screen, as if he were still waiting for someone to tell him it was a mistake. Jamal didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't react at all. He just waited. It was Morrison who spoke first, though his voice had lost all of its earlier bravado. That can't be right. The officer exhaled sharply, nodding toward the screen. It's right. He was confirmed for the federal bench. What, 5 years ago? Big case out of the district court? Hell, you probably read about him. Reed's expression had darkened considerably, his lips pressing into a tight line, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. So what you're telling me is, he stopped himself, inhaled sharply, recalibrated. You're saying we just brought in a federal judge. In cuffs. The officer at the desk gave them a look that made it painfully clear how much of a monumental screw-up this was. Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. And just like that, everything shifted. Reed was the first to move, stepping back from the desk and exhaling hard, running a hand over his jaw as though he could physically wipe away the situation unraveling in front of him. Morrison, for all his arrogance, suddenly looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing too late that he had miscalculated the drop. The apologies came quickly. Look, Judge Carter, Morrison started, his voice now alarmingly smooth, the aggression from earlier evaporating like mist in the sun. This was obviously just a big misunderstanding. You gotta understand. From our perspective, Jamal tilted his head slightly, watching as Morrison struggled to find words that might soften the weight of what had just occurred, words that might erase the last hour of humiliation, the last hour of absolute certainty that they had him in their grasp. I think we can handle it from here. The voice that cut through the room was firm, authoritative, carrying with it a weight that neither Reed nor Morrison dared to question. Captain Brooks. He strode forward, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, though there was an undeniable tension in the set of his shoulders, the kind of tension that came from walking into a situation already spiraling beyond control. Judge Carter, Brooks said, his tone polite but heavy, measured with the kind of diplomacy that only came when a man knew he was standing on thin ice. I just got briefed on what happened. I can assure you this will be handled. I want to personally apologize for the mistake. Jamal let the words settle, let them flounder under the weight of their own sudden regret. Then, finally, he gave a slow nod. Good, he said simply. Then we're done here. Brooks didn't argue. He didn't try to offer further explanations, further empty assurances. He simply nodded once, turning toward the desk officer with a sharp motion. Uncuff him. The officer scrambled to obey. And within seconds, the metal restraints snapped open, the pressure around Jamal's wrists finally releasing. He flexed his fingers briefly, feeling the blood rush back into his hands, but otherwise, he didn't react. Morrison and Reed stood frozen, their faces unreadable, their expressions tight. They had nothing left to say. Jamal rubbed his wrists absently as the last of the tension left his hands, the dull ache from the cuffs still present, but quickly becoming an afterthought. The silence in the room was thick now, a sharp contrast to the condescending arrogance that had filled the air just moments before. The weight of realization sat heavy on Morrison and Reed. their earlier confidence now stripped away, leaving only discomfort in its place. They stood stiffly, their postures no longer radiating control, but something closer to restrained panic, the reality of what they had done pressing in on them like an unbearable force. Morrison, whose smirk had been so ever-present throughout the stop, now looked as if he were struggling to decide whether to speak or to simply pray that silence might spare him further humiliation. Reed, the veteran of the two, had his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though he were physically holding back a curse. Jamal let them sit in that discomfort for a long moment, let the weight of their actions truly settle before he finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a scalpel. "You know," he began, taking a step forward, closing the distance just enough that neither of them could avoid looking at him, "I've spent years listening to cases just like this, years sitting on the bench while men just like you walked into my courtroom with that same smug certainty, that same absolute conviction that whatever you did out there in the streets, whatever lines you crossed, it would never come back to haunt you." He tilted his head slightly, letting his words sink in. "You thought you had this figured out. You thought you had me figured out. A black man in a nice car, no ID, slowing down on the road. You saw a story that fit your version of reality, and you ran with it, didn't you?" Neither officer answered, though Morrison looked as if he wanted to, whether to defend himself or simply to dig himself deeper. Jamal wasn't sure. Reed, on the other hand, simply kept his mouth shut, his expression hard but carefully neutral, as if remaining silent might somehow undo the damage already done. Jamal exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "What bothers me most isn't that you pulled me over," he continued, his voice never rising, never breaking its steady rhythm. "It's that even after you ran the registration, even after I told you exactly who I was, you still convinced yourselves I had stolen my own car. Because the truth didn't matter, did it? You'd already decided who I was before I even opened my mouth." Reed shifted slightly, still rigid, but the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed the way the words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Jamal didn't let up. "And let's be honest," he said, his gaze unwavering. "If I weren't who I am, if I were just another man driving home after a long day, if I didn't have a title and a reputation that made you stop and think, we both know I wouldn't be walking out of here right now. Would I?" The silence that followed was confirmation enough. Jamal let it linger for a few seconds longer before finally turning to Captain Brooks, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, his presence looming, his expression carefully neutral but undeniably wary. Unlike Morrison and Reed, he wasn't scrambling for excuses. He had seen enough years on the force to know when there was no spinning a situation in his favor. Brooks cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice steady, but laced with the slightest edge of practiced authority, "I want to assure you that this situation is going to be handled appropriately. There will be consequences for what happened tonight." Jamal studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity of his words, though he already knew the outcome before the words were even spoken. There would be consequences, yes, but nothing significant. A slap on the wrist, a quiet reprimand, a couple weeks of paid leave while the department made a show of reviewing the situation. He had seen this play out before. He had ruled on cases just like it. And the truth was, he didn't have the time or the energy to waste on a fight he knew wouldn't be won in a single night. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Good," he said simply, his tone giving away nothing. "Then, we're done here." There was a flicker of something across Morrison's face. Relief, maybe, or the realization that he had just been handed an undeserved out. Jamal didn't bother looking at him again. He had nothing more to say. Brooks nodded, stepping back slightly. "I'll have someone escort you out." Jamal didn't acknowledge it. He turned toward the door, his shoulders squared, his steps measured. Not rushed, not flustered. He wasn't leaving like a man who had been processed and let go. He was leaving like a man who had just walked into someone else's kingdom and reminded them who actually held the power. As he reached the exit, he felt the weight of their stares on his back, the unspoken truth hanging thick in the air. They had expected to teach him a lesson. Instead, they had just written their own downfall. And as Jamal stepped into the night, he hoped that they would learn their lesson, and something like this wouldn't happen again. Oh, how wrong he was. A week had passed since that night at the station, and though Jamal had done his best to push it aside, to bury the frustration beneath the endless obligations of his docket, the sting of it had lingered, settling somewhere deep in his chest. It wasn't just the stop itself, it was the fact that nothing had come of it. Nothing ever did. No hearings, no real reprimands, no policy changes. If Morrison and Reed had faced any consequences at all, they had been mild enough to be forgotten within a day or two. More likely, they had simply returned to their shifts as if nothing had happened, as if stopping a black man for no reason was just another part of the job. And now, here he was again. Jamal hadn't even been thinking about that night as he drove home, the unassuming rental car humming quietly beneath his hands, the sleek comfort of his Mercedes temporarily absent while it sat in the shop for servicing. He had spent the evening at dinner with colleagues, debating legal precedents, hashing out arguments over low-lit tables and half-sipped whiskey. It had been a normal night, uneventful, until now. The flash of red and blue filled his rearview mirror, bright and accusing, snapping him back into something far uglier than a casual debate over case law. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, the anger flaring up before he could suppress it, because he already knew. He knew before he even looked. And when he did, when he stole that quick glance at the silhouette approaching his car, he felt something cold settle in his chest. Morrison. They didn't recognize him. Of course they didn't, because to them, he had never been a person to begin with. Jamal exhaled slowly, controlled. But this time, something in him snapped into place. Something different. Something sharper. The last time this had happened, he had tried to reason, had tried to demand accountability, had expected that his position, his power, his influence might mean something. It hadn't. And now, they had just given him another chance. He let them come to him. Morrison moved with that same casual arrogance, that same predatory slowness, as if he were savoring the moment, as if he already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Reed hung back slightly, watching, waiting, his hand near his holster, though not drawing. "License and registration," Morrison said, his voice clipped, impatient, utterly devoid of recognition. Jamal just stared at him. And then, before Morrison could even begin his usual routine, before the script could play out the way it had before, Jamal let out a breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "Really?" His voice was low, incredulous. "You don't know who I am?" Morrison frowned slightly, the first flicker of something unfamiliar flashing across his face. Uncertainty. "Sir," he said, more forcefully now, "I asked you for your license and registration." Jamal didn't move, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't offer his name. Instead, he did something he hadn't done before. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and with deliberate, unhurried movements, tapped the screen. The camera flipped on, and he hit record. The red light blinked to life, the image of Morrison's face captured in crisp clarity, the streetlights casting sharp shadows across his features. The moment Morrison realized what was happening, his posture stiffened slightly, the easy arrogance dimming just enough that Jamal caught it, saw the flicker of hesitation before it was buried beneath another layer of hostility. "Sir," Morrison said again, his voice harder now, "turn off the phone and comply." Jamal tilted his head slightly, a quiet, humorless laugh escaping him. "Oh no, not this time." His voice was steady, clear, meant to be heard. "You want my license? You want my name? You'll have to wait, because I want the world to see exactly what you do next." Reed took a step closer, his presence meant to intimidate, but Jamal didn't flinch. He just kept the phone exactly where it was, aimed, unwavering, the seconds ticking by in real time. "You were driving erratically," Morrison snapped, his tone sharper now, the lie falling from his lips with well-practiced ease. Jamal let out another bitter laugh. "That's the best you've got?" he asked, his voice steady, controlled. "A week ago, you said I fit the description. Now it's erratic driving. What's next? A broken tail light? Smelled something suspicious?" He let the words sit, let them sink in. "Go ahead, say it. Tell the camera why you really pulled me over." Morrison shifted slightly, a muscle in his jaw twitching, because now the script was breaking. "Step out of the vehicle," Morrison ordered. Jamal didn't move. He just kept recording. "Step out, or what?" Jamal's voice was colder now, cutting through the air like a blade. "You going to pull me out? Slam me against the hood? Maybe rough me up a little?" His eyes flicked toward Reed, toward the subtle way the man's fingers flexed near his holster. "Or maybe this time you'll skip straight to the part where you say you feared for your life and call it a justified use of force." Morrison's face wasn't as smug now, and Jamal knew why. Because this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This wasn't just another man they could bully, humiliate, and then toss aside without a second thought. This was a problem. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And worst of all, it was all on camera. Jamal saw the calculation happening in real time. The flicker of uncertainty in Morrison's eyes, the slight hesitation in Reed's posture, the unspoken exchange happening between them as they realized they were dangerously close to making a very costly mistake. But they had already gone too far, and now they had no choice but to see it through. Morrison exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders back as though shaking off the discomfort, before leaning in just slightly, his voice dropping an octave lower. "You want to play games, boy?" The word dripped with bitterness now, filled with the realization that he should have known who he was dealing with. "Fine. You just made this a whole lot worse for yourself." Jamal's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No," he murmured, his voice like steel under velvet. "I just made it a whole lot worse for you. And this time? This time, they wouldn't get away with it." Morrison's jaw tightened as he stared at the red recording light blinking on Jamal's phone, the flickering glow capturing every movement, every tense breath, every calculated pause. He had been in enough situations to know that this was no longer just another stop, no longer just another man they could bully into submission, because this time, the man in front of him wasn't falling in line. This time, he was making them work for it. Morrison's patience snapped. "I said, step out of the damn car," he barked, yanking the door open so hard it nearly bounced back on its hinges. Jamal barely had time to brace himself before Morrison's hand clamped onto his arm, gripping tight, fingers digging in with bruising force as he jerked him forward. Jamal twisted slightly, just enough to keep the phone aimed at Morrison's face, his voice sharp, edged with something lethal. "You just can't help yourselves, can you?" he bit out, his breath steady despite the way Morrison's grip tightened like a vice. "Not enough to pull me over for nothing. You need to put your hands on me too? You want to act tough?" Morrison sneered, pulling harder. "Fine, let's see how tough you are when you're face down on the pavement." Before Jamal could respond, Reed was there too, his presence sudden, his hands rough, shoving him forward with enough force to send him stumbling against the car. Jamal gritted his teeth, his shoulders slamming into the frame, but he never let go of the phone, never let the camera angle drop. He wanted this recorded, every second of it. Morrison grabbed the wrist, still holding the phone, wrenching it downward. But Jamal twisted his arm at the last second, keeping the camera angled just enough to catch the fury in Morrison's face, the smirk twisting Reed's lips, the barely concealed amusement in their eyes. "You don't get to record this," Morrison snapped, trying again to pry the phone from his grip. Jamal let out a sharp breath, his body tensing against the pressure on his arm, but his voice remained steady, unwavering. "Oh, I think I do," he shot back. Morrison shoved him harder against the car, pressing his weight down, and for the first time, there was real anger behind it. You think you're something, don't you? Morrison hissed, his breath hot against Jamal's ear, his tone dripping with condescension. You think your little phone's gonna save you? You're just another nobody running his mouth. Jamal stilled. For the first time, his body locked in place. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something colder, something lethal. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head just enough to meet Morrison's gaze, his lips curling into something not quite a smile. "Say that again," he murmured, his voice low, controlled. Morrison's nostrils flared, his grip tightening. "I said, you're a nobody." Jamal let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly, his voice dripping with something close to pity. "Not tonight. I'm not," he said, lifting his phone higher, angling it perfectly to catch Morrison's face in sharp, unforgiving clarity. Reed, seeing the moment slipping, lunged in. The next shove was harder, punishing, a deliberate show of force. Jamal's chest hit the car hood, the breath momentarily forced from his lungs, his phone barely staying in his grip as both officers closed in on him now, pinning him down. "Stop resisting!" Reed barked, his knee digging into Jamal's back, his hands yanking his arms behind him, the cuffs biting into his wrists with no restraint, no caution. "I'm not resisting, you piece of—" Jamal's words were cut off as Morrison grabbed the back of his shirt and pulled. "Shut up!" Morrison snapped, his voice a snarl now, no longer trying to mask the contempt. "You're gonna learn your place tonight." Jamal let out a sharp exhale, the cuffs biting into his skin as he held on tight to his phone, his body compressed between the hood and the officer's weight. But he never stopped talking. "You know what your problem is?" he rasped, tilting his head slightly. He wanted the camera to catch this, wanted every word imprinted into the video, into evidence, into history. "You think this ends the way you want it to." Morrison yanked him back up, shoving him toward the patrol car with enough force that his feet barely caught the pavement in time. "Yeah?" Morrison sneered. "And how exactly does it end, genius?" Jamal inhaled sharply, regaining his footing, his spine straightening despite the weight of their hands still pressing against him. He turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry, for his next words to land with the precise weight they needed to. "It ends with you watching this on the news tomorrow." Morrison's grip faltered. Reed stiffened. For the first time, they hesitated, because that was the moment it clicked. This wasn't just another stop. This wasn't just another arrest. This was a mistake. A mistake that wasn't going to disappear, because now, the whole world was watching. The weight of Morrison's hand still pressed against Jamal's back, shoving him toward the squad car with force that had nothing to do with proper procedure, and everything to do with anger, frustration, and the raw desperation of a man who had just realized he was in too deep. Jamal could feel it. The moment the balance had shifted, the instant they knew they had gone too far. But they weren't stopping. They couldn't, because stopping meant acknowledging what had just happened. Stopping meant admitting they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And instead of backing off, instead of realizing that there was no walking this back, Morrison and Reed did what men like them always did when they lost control. They doubled down. "Well," Morrison muttered, his grip tightening around Jamal's bicep as he shoved him forward again, "maybe that phone of yours stops working once it gets to evidence." Jamal barked out a sharp laugh, the sound raw, bitter, furious. "Oh, so that's the game now?" He turned his head, as much as the grip on him would allow, his breath ragged, his words spilling out, sharp and cutting. "That's how you clean this up? You destroy the evidence? You pretend none of this happened? You know what, Morrison? That's not gonna work this time. Because I promise you, people already saw." Reed scoffed, but there was something off about it, something strained, as if he too had realized how fast the ground was shifting beneath them. "You keep running your mouth like that, and you're gonna wish you hadn't," Reed warned, his voice edged with something ugly, something dangerous. Jamal's chest rose and fell sharply, his breath coming faster now, not out of fear, but out of pure, unfiltered rage. "Oh, I should shut up now," he snapped. "Is that what you want? You think I don't know what this is? You think I don't see exactly what you're doing? This isn't about erratic driving. This isn't about obstruction. This is about the fact that I am a black man in a car that you decided was too nice for me. This is about the fact that you don't see people like me. You see a problem. You see a threat. And you react the only way you know how." Morrison's grip tightened painfully. "You're making this a whole lot worse for yourself." Jamal laughed again, but this time it was pure rage, pure disbelief, pure exhaustion. "No," he spat. "You made this worse the second you pulled me over for no damn reason. You made this worse when you put your hands on me, when you shoved me into the car, when you put those cuffs on me like I was some kind of animal. You did this, and now that you realize you've screwed up, now that you know you're on camera, now you want to talk about making things worse?" He shook his head, his hands curling into fists behind him, his body shaking from the sheer fury coursing through him. "You know what?" he continued, his voice rising. "I hope you do take my phone. I hope you wipe the video. I hope you try to erase it, because it won't matter. You think I'm the only one who saw? You think people aren't already watching? You think they don't know exactly what you are? You think they haven't seen men like you do this before?" Morrison's hand jerked violently, his patience snapping as he wrenched Jamal's arm at an unnatural angle. "I said, I am tired of men like you!" Jamal's voice exploded through the night, the sheer force of it bouncing off the walls, off the pavement, off the hollow silence of a world that had heard these words 1,000 times before and still hadn't changed. "I am tired of being treated like a damn criminal every time I step into my own car, every time I walk down my own street. I am tired of seeing my brothers and sisters end up in the ground because men like you don't know how to do your damn jobs without a gun in your hand and hate in your heart." His voice was shaking now, shaking from the rawness of it, from the truth, from the fire that had been simmering for years, decades, generations. And Morrison didn't like it. Didn't like the way Jamal wasn't cowering. Didn't like the way he was yelling, screaming, refusing to be small. Didn't like the way his words were cutting deep enough to leave a mark. So he did the only thing a coward knew how to do. He silenced him. The punch came out of nowhere. Fast, brutal. The full weight of Morrison's rage crashing against Jamal's jaw. The impact sent a shockwave through his skull, his head snapping sideways, pain flaring white-hot behind his eyes. And his phone, the one thing capturing it all, slipped from his fingers. It hit the pavement with a hollow thud, tumbling once, twice, before landing at an angle that still caught everything. Jamal stumbled, his vision blurring, his balance thrown as Morrison's hand dug into the back of his neck, forcing him against the patrol car. "You talk too damn much," Morrison growled. Jamal's breath was ragged, his pulse hammering. But he forced himself to lift his head, his jaw aching, his lips split, blood pooling in his mouth. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter now, but deadlier. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Morrison didn't respond, but the way his breath hitched, the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly, meant that he knew, and beneath them, on the pavement, the phone was still recording. Because this time, there would be consequences, and Morrison had just ensured he would be the first to face them. The squad car's back seat was cold, hard, and far too familiar. The plastic bench beneath him had no give. The air smelled of stale sweat and desperation. The metal grate separating the front from the back was scratched and worn, its surface carved with the desperate etchings of those who had sat there before him. Men just like him. Jamal tilted his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling, the throbbing in his jaw dull compared to the fire burning in his chest. The copper taste of blood lingered on his tongue, his split lip aching every time he flexed it. But none of that mattered, because right now, all he could do was laugh. At first, it was quiet, just a small exhale, a low chuckle that barely broke the silence. But then it grew, rising, spilling out of him, shaking his shoulders with something dark, something knowing, something so damn satisfying that it made Morrison glance at Reed with a flicker of unease. "You think this is funny?" Morrison snapped, twisting in his seat to glare through the partition. His fingers were still tight around the steering wheel, knuckles white, tension laced through his entire body. He was still mad, still feeling the heat of everything that had just happened. Jamal grinned through the blood on his lips, shaking his head slightly, eyes glinting in the dim patrol car lights. "You don't even realize it yet, do you?" His voice was hoarse, but smooth, touched with the kind of amusement that only comes when you've already won. But the other guy hasn't figured it out yet. Reed scoffed, shifting in his seat, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the unease creeping in. "I don't know what the hell you're laughing about, boy. You should be praying we don't add resisting arrest to your charges." Jamal let his smile stretch just a little wider. "Oh, I hope you do." Morrison frowned, his grip tightening on the wheel. "You want to explain what's so damn funny?" Jamal let out another low, deep, knowing laugh, shifting his arms as much as the cuffs would allow, settling comfortably into the seat like a man who had already made peace with the outcome. "I just can't believe it," he murmured, almost to himself. "I mean, really? Again?" Morrison's frown deepened. "The hell are you talking about?" Jamal glanced at him, tilting his head slightly, letting them stew in their own stupidity for just a moment longer. Then, with a slow, deliberate smirk, he said, "You still don't recognize me?" Reed turned slightly in his seat, his frown now shifting into something more uncertain, something skeptical, like he was searching his brain for something just out of reach. Morrison just shook his head, annoyed, impatient, unwilling to entertain whatever game he thought was being played. "Recognize you? Man, I don't give a damn who you are. You're just another loudmouth punk who thought he could talk his way out of a stop." Jamal inhaled slowly, the sheer delicious irony of it all settling deep in his chest, like a slow burn. "That's what you think?" he asked, his voice smooth, low, filled with something dangerous. "That I'm just another loudmouth punk?" Morrison's lip curled. "Damn right. You all run your mouths. But the second you get cuffed, you ain't so tough anymore. Let me guess. You're one of those educated ones, huh?" He twisted in his seat a little more, smirking now, like he was settling into something comfortable, something ugly. "Got yourself a nice job, thinking that means you get to talk back to the law. You one of those pull yourself up by the bootstraps types? Thinking you're better than the rest of them just 'cause you wear a damn suit?" Jamal exhaled, shaking his head slightly, the laugh still sitting on his lips. He knew men like this, men who saw someone like him and needed to make sure he understood he would never be good enough. "You just can't help yourselves, can you?" Jamal mused, voice almost light, almost entertained. "You could have let this go, could have just written a citation, could have let me drive home. But you needed this. You needed to feel that control, that little rush of power. Needed to remind me where I stand." Reed let out a rough scoff. "Yeah? And where's that?" Jamal smiled, and this time, it was real. "Above you." Morrison's expression shifted immediately, his entire body tensing like a coiled spring. "You son of a... You want to hit me again?" Jamal cut in smoothly, leaning forward just enough that the partition reflected the dim glow of his eyes. "Go ahead. Let's make sure that's on camera too. You've already dug your own grave. Might as well jump in." Reed shook his head, scoffing. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Jamal met his gaze in the rearview mirror. His eyes burned. "Oh," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "I know I am." Morrison turned back toward the windshield, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was grinding his teeth to dust. His hands flexed on the wheel, his knuckles still white. For the rest of the ride, he didn't say another word, because deep down, he felt it too. Something was wrong. Something wasn't going to end the way it usually did. And Jamal? He could already taste the moment they figured it out. It was going to be so damn sweet. The police station was alive with its usual noise, the hum of officers moving in and out, the low murmur of voices filling out reports, the occasional bark of orders from across the room. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the air thick with the scent of coffee gone stale and disinfectant failing to cover the years of sweat and desperation soaked into the walls. Jamal stepped inside with his head high, shoulders squared, every inch of him radiating a presence that didn't belong in a place like this. Not because he was above it. He had seen the inside of precincts before, had represented people whose only crime had been existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, but because he knew how this was about to end. And that made it almost impossible not to smile. Morrison's grip was still tight around his arm, his fingers pressing deep enough into Jamal's bicep to bruise, as if he thought the force of it might somehow shake him, might rattle him the way it had rattled so many others. But it didn't. Jamal walked forward without resistance, not because he was beaten, but because he knew they had already lost. Reed leaned in slightly, his smirk back now that they were within the walls of the precinct, his confidence returning, the weight of institutional protection settling back over him like armor. "Guess that mouth of yours ain't working too well now, huh?" he muttered, voice dripping with amusement. Jamal exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, his lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, you boys are in for a hell of a night," he murmured, his voice so calm, so dangerously assured that it made Morrison's fingers twitch against his arm, his grip tightening instinctively. Reed scoffed, shoving open the processing room door, guiding Jamal toward the counter where a bored-looking officer sat tapping lazily on a keyboard. "All right, we got one for you," Reed said, his voice laced with an arrogance that had absolutely no foundation. "Obstruction. Resisting. Might throw in assault. Depends on how we're feeling in the morning." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head as he tilted his head slightly toward the camera mounted in the corner. "Make sure you get all that on record," he said smoothly. "Wouldn't want to misrepresent anything, would we?" Reed's smirk twitched slightly, but he kept his cool, kept the bravado. For now. "Hey, you know what?" Morrison said, stepping up beside him, his own voice filled with the kind of faux concern that made Jamal's stomach churn. "Why don't you tell us how this all ends, huh? Since you're so damn sure you know." Jamal exhaled through his nose, tilting his chin up slightly as the processing officer gestured for him to step forward, his fingers already reaching for the keyboard, ready to type in his name. "Oh, you'll know soon enough," Jamal mused, his voice edged with something sharp, something far too knowing. "But if I were you, I'd be thinking real hard about what you want to do next. Because, fellas," he let out a soft chuckle, "there's still a chance to walk away from this with your jobs. Not a good one, but hey, I like to be generous." Morrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh, shaking his head. "Man, you don't shut up, do you?" Jamal shrugged, his wrists still cuffed, but his posture entirely unbothered. "Nah," he said smoothly, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. "And that's why you're in this mess." Reed grunted, his fingers tapping against the counter in impatience as the officer behind the desk continued typing. The sound of keys clacking against the silence filled the room, the seconds dragging out, long enough that Morrison and Reed were starting to fidget. Jamal let the moment breathe, let them get comfortable, let them sit in their false confidence. He wanted them to enjoy it, because soon it would be ripped right out from under them. And then it happened. "Morrison! Reed!" The voice that cut through the station was sharp, furious, echoing through the walls like a gunshot. The entire room froze. Morrison and Reed stiffened immediately, their shoulders locking, their jaws tightening, because they knew that voice. Jamal knew it too. Captain Brooks. Jamal let out a slow, measured exhale, his smile stretching just slightly, just enough to make Morrison's fingers twitch. Right on time. Brooks's footsteps were heavy, sharp, marching straight toward them, his voice like gravel and fire. Tell me you did not just— The words cut off sharply, as if he was so furious that he couldn't even finish the sentence. Jamal turned his head slightly, catching the first flicker of realization, of panic, of absolute horror sinking into Morrison's expression. And that was when he let the full smile break across his face, because they had just realized, and it was going to be glorious. Jamal had always believed in timing. The way a pause could hold weight in a courtroom. The way a well-placed silence could make a witness squirm. The way a calculated delay could send an entire case crumbling to the ground. He had spent years mastering the art of waiting, of letting people dig their own graves, of allowing their arrogance to push them past the point of no return before hitting them with the truth. And now, he was witnessing the greatest fall of all. Captain Brooks was already storming toward them, his expression a mask of fury, his voice cutting through the noise of the precinct like a blade. "Tell me," he seethed, each word dripping with barely restrained rage. "Tell me you did not just arrest this man." "Again!" Reed froze. Morrison's face drained of all color. Jamal let out a soft chuckle, tilting his head slightly as he glanced at them. "Oh," he murmured, his voice thick with mock sympathy. "They did." Brooks came to a dead stop in front of them, his chest rising and falling with barely restrained fury. His eyes locked onto Morrison first, his gaze so sharp, so filled with disgust, that Morrison flinched before he could stop himself. "You're telling me," Brooks growled, each word dropping like a stone, "that after last week, after the reports, after the complaints, after I told you idiots to be careful, after I gave you the easiest out in the damn world, you still—" He cut himself off, exhaling sharply, his hands clenching into fists. Morrison wasn't breathing. Reed was staring at the floor. And Jamal? Jamal was enjoying every second of it, because now, they finally knew. "You morons didn't even recognize him, did you?" Brooks spat, his voice rising, furious, disgusted, incredulous all at once. "You arrested the same goddamn man. Again." Reed slowly lifted his head, his throat working like he was trying to swallow something bitter, something sharp. He looked at Jamal for the first time, really looked. His eyes dragged over his face, over his bloodied lip, over the smirk stretching across his mouth. And that was the exact second it hit. Morrison let out a sharp inhale, his body going rigid, his breath catching as realization hit him like a train. Jamal waited until he saw it fully settle into their bones, until he saw the horror spread across their faces, until he felt the weight of their regret crash down on them all at once. Then he let the smile break free. "Yeah," Jamal drawled, his voice dripping with amusement, watching them unravel with pure, unfiltered joy. "You did it again." Morrison's eyes darted wildly, as if searching for a way out, a loophole, an excuse, a lifeline. His mouth opened, then closed, his lips parting like he was about to argue. But there was nothing to argue, because there was no escape this time. "Sir," Morrison tried, his voice cracking just slightly, the arrogance gone now, burned away by the unbearable heat of reality. We didn't know." Brooks snapped toward him so fast that Morrison flinched again. "Oh, you didn't know?" Brooks mocked, his voice deadly. "You didn't know? What? You mean to tell me that you're so damn used to pulling over black men for no reason that you can't even keep track of which ones you've arrested?" Jamal laughed. Morrison visibly recoiled. Reed looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Brooks exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his lips pressing into a thin, furious line. "Do you have any idea," he said slowly, voice low, "any idea what you've done? Any idea what's happening outside this damn building right now?" Morrison and Reed didn't answer, because now, they were starting to understand. Jamal could practically see the panic setting in, seeping into their bones, twisting its way into their muscles, their breathing, their expressions. "You know what's funny?" he mused, shifting slightly so that the fluorescent lights cast a perfect glow on his bruised face, highlighting the blood at the corner of his mouth, the raw skin on his wrists. I told you. I told you exactly how this would end, and you still walked straight into it. Morrison's hands clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. You think this is a joke? Reed snapped suddenly, his voice shaky, uneven, desperate. Jamal turned his head slightly, studying him, then let out another low chuckle. Oh, no, he murmured, his voice mocking, slow, deliberate. I think it's a damn tragedy. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, making sure they felt every syllable. And you? You two are the punchline. Reed looked sick. Morrison was breathing like a man on the verge of a full breakdown. And Brooks? Brooks looked like he was 2 seconds away from tearing them apart himself. You think this ends with a slap on the wrist? Jamal continued, his voice a razor-sharp edge slicing through their panic. You think you're walking away from this? This isn't just an arrest. This is national news. You think nobody saw what you did? You think that video disappeared? He chuckled, shaking his head, his voice thick with satisfaction. No, that video is on 100 different accounts right now. 1,000. People are watching it, sharing it, talking about it. You know what's trending right now? Your damn badge numbers. Reed physically staggered. Morrison looked like he might be sick. You're done, Jamal said simply. Career's over. Lives ruined. Congratulations. Brooks exhaled sharply, running a rough hand over his face. Get them out of my sight, he muttered, shaking his head, voice laced with sheer disgust. Morrison's head snapped up, panic fully taking over now. Wait. Brooks didn't look at him. You're suspended, he said flatly, coldly, like he wasn't even thinking about it. Effective immediately. Captain, you'll be lucky if that's all, Brooks snarled, eyes burning. Because if I get even one call from the mayor's office, if I get even one email from the DOJ, you won't have a job to come back to. Silence. Thick, suffocating, irreversible silence. Morrison's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind clearly running in circles, grasping for something, anything, to save himself. But there was nothing left, nothing to say, nothing to fix it. Because Jamal had been right from the start, they were screwed. And Jamal? Jamal couldn't stop smiling. Jamal barely had time to step outside the station before he was engulfed by the chaos waiting for him. Cameras, reporters, flashing lights, shouted questions. It was a full-blown media circus, the kind that swallowed entire news cycles, the kind that turned local scandals into national reckonings. The crowd outside had tripled since he first arrived, the sidewalk packed with journalists, activists, concerned citizens, and people with phones raised, recording, live streaming, sending the story further and further out into the world. The air buzzed with energy, thick with anger, with anticipation, with something on the edge of combustion. Judge Carter! Judge Carter! A reporter near the front pushed forward, voice breathless, microphone already extended toward him. Can you confirm whether the department has issued an official apology? Jamal exhaled, adjusting his suit jacket, his movements smooth, controlled. He had prepared for this. He turned his head slightly, scanning the sea of microphones and cameras, noting the familiar faces of national news anchors mixed with independent journalists, the sheer range of media presence proving just how big this story had become. He let the question hang in the air for a moment before speaking. I haven't received a single phone call, he said, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd, calm, steady, but pointed. Not from the department, not from the mayor's office, not from anyone in a position of authority. What I have received, however, is overwhelming support from the community, from people across the country who know that this isn't just about me. This is about a system that has been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. More voices surged forward, shouting over one another, trying to get the next question in. Judge Carter, what would you say to people who argue this was just a misunderstanding? Jamal let out a sharp breath, Not quite a laugh, but something close to it. A misunderstanding? He echoed, shaking his head. It's interesting how these misunderstandings always seem to happen to men who look like me. The crowd shifted, a low murmur rippling through them. Sir, are you planning to take legal action? Jamal's lips pressed together slightly, his head tilting as he considered the question. There are already federal and local investigations underway, he said smoothly. I trust the evidence speaks for itself. Then, after a brief pause, he added, but make no mistake, this is far from over. The murmurs became full-on shouts, reporters scrambling to get their follow-ups in. Judge Carter, do you believe the officers should be fired? Do you think this could lead to larger police reforms? Have you spoken with the mayor? Before he could respond, the crowd shifted again, the energy in the air snapping to attention as a new wave of urgency surged through them. Jamal turned his head slightly, following the movement, and then there they were, Morrison and Reed, being escorted out of the precinct, not through the back door, not shielded from the cameras, but straight through the front like any other suspect. The press exploded. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters shouted, microphones thrust forward, a barrage of questions cutting through the air. Officers Morrison and Reed, do you have anything to say for yourselves? Are you aware that your arrests have sparked national outrage? Will you be resigning? The two men looked like walking ghosts. Morrison's jaw was tight, his face pale, his hands curled into tense fists at his sides. Reed looked even worse, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow to land at any moment. They weren't wearing their uniforms anymore. No badges, no protection, just two men in cheap suits, caught in the wreckage of their own destruction. Jamal crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched them, absorbing every flicker of panic, every ounce of desperation bleeding through their carefully constructed facades. And then Morrison looked at him. It was brief, just a second, maybe less. But in that second, Jamal saw it, the full weight of realization crashing down, the understanding that there was no getting out of this. Jamal lifted his chin slightly, his expression unreadable, but his silence said everything. You did this to yourselves. Morrison turned away sharply, his face twisting, his shoulders locking like a man trying to hold back the inevitable. Reed kept walking, head down, feet moving too fast, like he just wanted to disappear. Jamal exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle deep into his bones, letting it solidify as the first real consequence of their actions took shape. But this was only the beginning, because the media wasn't letting this go, because the world had seen it, because the video had been replayed on every news station, dissected in articles, analyzed by legal experts, debated by politicians, condemned by activists, supported by protesters. And now? Now there was a disciplinary hearing waiting for them. And after that, a courtroom. And Morrison and Reed, they were about to lose everything. The hearing room inside the precinct was sterile, cold, the kind of place where careers unraveled in real time. The long wooden table at the front bore the weight of the disciplinary panel, 3 high-ranking officers and a civilian oversight representative, each of them seated with stiff backs and unreadable expressions, their presence a signal that this was no ordinary review. This was a reckoning. The room was full, every seat occupied. Officers, department heads, lawyers, representatives from the police union, internal affairs investigators, all of them gathered to witness the moment. 2 men who had once moved through these halls with impunity were now forced to answer for what they had done. Jamal sat near the back, an invited observer, his expression calm, composed, his presence a silent reminder that there would be no sweeping this under the rug. And at the center of it all, Morrison and Reed. Seated side by side, they looked smaller than they had before, their arrogance stripped away, their carefully constructed authority unraveling thread by thread. They had arrived in their department-issued suits, their badges still pinned to their chests, but everyone in that room knew they wouldn't be leaving with them. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with unspoken finality. Captain Brooks stood at the front, the weight of responsibility pressing heavy on his shoulders, his face a mask of disgust and reluctant obligation. He exhaled sharply, tapping a file against the desk before flipping it open, his voice firm, controlled, but laced with something bitter. "Officers Morrison and Reed," he began, "you are here today to answer for multiple allegations of misconduct, including excessive force, wrongful detainment, and violation of department policies. The evidence against you is not just overwhelming. It is irrefutable. We have video footage, witness statements, and undeniable proof of the abuse of your authority." Morrison stared straight ahead, his jaw locked so tight it looked as if his teeth might crack. Reed sat just as rigid, but his hands were restless, his fingers twitching against the table like he was resisting the urge to speak, to argue, to fight back. Brooks didn't stop. "This is not just about one incident," he continued. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has now come to light because of your actions." He lifted a document, flipping through it before tossing it onto the table in front of them. "Your complaint records have been reviewed. Multiple reports of racial profiling, unnecessary escalation, improper searches, and excessive force, all buried under layers of internal protections." The room was silent. "Tell me something," Brooks muttered, his voice low, sharp, cutting. "Did you even think for a second about what you were doing when you pulled him over again? Or was it just so normal to you that you didn't even bother remembering the face of the man you humiliated a week earlier?" Morrison breathed heavily through his nose, his hands curling into fists on his lap. Reed looked down, his jaw working like he was biting the inside of his cheek, holding back the frustration of a man who thought his badge had made him untouchable. Brooks shook his head. "Pathetic," he muttered. "Absolutely pathetic." He straightened, his voice now carrying authority. "Finality. The disciplinary panel has reviewed all evidence and unanimously voted for your immediate termination from the department. Effective immediately, you will no longer be employed by this police force, and your badges and service weapons will be confiscated before you leave this building. Furthermore, this department will cooperate fully with any ongoing federal and state investigations regarding your conduct." Morrison's breath hitched, his shoulders jerking slightly as if the words had finally struck him. Reed let out a slow, uneven exhale, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. Brooks turned toward the officer standing at the side of the room, nodding once. "Take their badges." The room was so silent that the sound of the officer's boots moving across the floor felt deafening. The man stopped in front of them, standing stiffly, his presence a confirmation that the department had already washed its hands of them. Morrison clenched his jaw, his hands trembling slightly as he reached up, his fingers hesitating at the edge of his badge. For years, that badge had meant power, authority, protection. Now it was nothing more than a liability. With a sharp, jerking motion, Morrison unpinned it from his chest and placed it onto the table with a loud clank. Reed followed, his movements slower, his badge trembling slightly between his fingers before he let it go. Jamal watched it all, absorbing the weight of the moment, the realization, the silent, crushing defeat settling into their shoulders. They had walked into this building thinking they would be protected, but now, they were just two men in a room full of people who would rather forget they had ever worn those uniforms. Brooks exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, clearly fighting back the urge to say more, to berate them, to make them understand the sheer scale of their downfall. Instead, he turned back to the panel. "This concludes the disciplinary review. Officers Morrison and Reed are officially stripped of their positions, and they are to leave the premises immediately." The officer next to them gestured toward the door. Morrison didn't move at first. Neither did Reed. They sat there, their bodies frozen, their breathing uneven, their minds clearly scrambling for some last-minute miracle that would undo what had just happened. But there was nothing left to undo. The door behind them opened, and the officers standing outside, The ones who had once been their colleagues, their friends, stared at them like strangers. Reed's fingers twitched slightly. Then, slowly, he stood, his face blank, his movements stiff. Morrison followed, his hands clenched at his sides, his posture screaming of a man barely containing his rage, his disbelief, his sheer inability to process that this was real. And Jamal? Jamal sat perfectly still, watching as Morrison turned one last time, his eyes burning, his mouth twisting like he wanted to say something, like he wanted to lash out, like he wanted to blame anyone but himself. But he didn't. Because he knew. They both did. They had lost. They had finally, irrevocably, lost. And as the two former officers walked toward the exit, their badges forever gone, their lives irreparably shattered, Jamal allowed himself one final moment of satisfaction. Because this was justice. But it wasn't over yet. Because now, they were going to court. The courtroom was a theater of scrutiny, tension woven into every breath, every glance, every subtle shift of posture among those seated in the gallery. The press had filled every available space, their notepads poised, cameras flashing in the hallways beyond the heavy wooden doors, broadcasting every moment to a nation that had stopped to watch. Morrison and Reed sat at the defense table, their presence reduced to something small, diminished, no longer officers but defendants in a case that had already convicted them in the court of public opinion. Jamal Carter sat on the witness stand, his face calm, composed, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of what had happened. You had been stopped by the defendants before, is that correct? The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with the presence of a hammer about to drop, asked. Jamal let the question sit in the air for a moment, watching Morrison and Reed from across the room, taking in the way they sat rigid, barely breathing, waiting for the damage to land. Yes, he said, his voice smooth but deliberate. I had. And can you describe the circumstances of that first stop? Jamal shifted slightly, exhaling slowly before he spoke. I was driving home. My own car, registered in my name. I slowed down because I realized I had left my wallet at home. That was when I saw the lights flashing behind me. Officers Morrison and Reed approached my vehicle. I complied with everything they asked. But compliance didn't matter, because they had already decided who I was before I even spoke. The room remained eerily silent, the weight of his words sinking into the very walls. And what happened next? They accused me of suspicious behavior, claimed they had reason to believe I was involved in criminal activity. Jamal let his gaze settle on the jury now, making sure they understood the absurdity of it, the humiliation, the sheer inevitability of it. They pulled me out of my own car, searched it, detained me, humiliated me, and when they found nothing, they still took me in. He let out a soft, humorless breath. Then they realized their mistake, which was, Jamal lifted his chin slightly, his presence steady, unshaken, that I was Judge Jamal Carter, a sitting federal judge. The words hit the room like a gavel strike. Some jurors visibly stiffened. Others exchanged glances, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Because this was not just a case of bad policing. This was something deeper, something systemic. And what happened after they realized their mistake? The prosecutor pressed. Jamal exhaled slowly. Nothing. The silence stretched, waiting for elaboration. They let me go, he continued, voice steady, controlled. No charges, no explanation, no apology. And he hesitated briefly, then shook his head. I let it go too. I thought maybe they would learn something from that the next time they saw a black man in a nice car, they might think twice before assuming the worst. That maybe, just maybe, there could be some accountability. And did that happen? Jamal let out a sharp laugh, not amused, but bitter, exhausted. No, he said simply. Why not? Jamal turned his gaze toward Morrison and Reed again, watching as they shifted, as the weight of it all pressed into their shoulders. Because a week later, they pulled me over again, only this time They didn't recognize me. He let the words sink in, watching the jury take it in, process the sheer absurdity of it. Same officers, different car, same pattern. His voice was sharper now, each word edged with something heavy. They accused me of stealing my own rental. They didn't ask for clarification. They didn't investigate. They saw me, made up their minds, and before I could even explain, they pulled me out of the car, slammed me against it, and cuffed me. Jamal's hands remained still on his lap, but the memory was still fresh, the cold steel of the cuffs, the weight of their hands on him, the undeniable understanding that no matter what he said, they had already decided how this was going to end. "Did you resist?" the prosecutor asked. Jamal shook his head. "No, I didn't need to." He leaned forward slightly, letting his voice carry. "Because I recorded everything." A few jurors shifted, some nodding slightly, their faces tightening as they recalled the footage they had seen, the brutal clarity of it, the irrefutable proof. "You complied," the prosecutor said, emphasizing it, making sure the jury understood. "And yet, you were still forcibly arrested, still assaulted while in handcuffs, and still treated as a criminal, despite having done nothing wrong?" Jamal nodded once. "Correct." Morrison's hands clenched into fists in his lap. Reed's breath was uneven now, barely controlled. And at what point did they realize their mistake? Jamal's lips pressed together briefly, a flicker of something dark flashing in his eyes. When they got to the station, when their captain yelled their names across the precinct, when the reality of what they had done finally caught up with them, he let the words settle before adding, "And by then, it was too late." The prosecutor let the moment breathe before taking a step back. "Your Honor, no further questions." The judge nodded. "Defense?" Morrison and Reed's attorney, a middle-aged man with the look of someone who knew he was fighting a losing battle, stood. He adjusted his jacket, cleared his throat, and approached the stand. "Judge Carter," he said smoothly, his tone attempting a kind of forced neutrality, "would you say that Officers Morrison and Reed acted out of malice? Or was this simply a tragic misunderstanding?" Jamal's brow lifted slightly, the question almost laughable. "Misunderstanding," he repeated, voice calm but sharp. "Counselor, I was stopped twice by the same officers within the span of a week. I was detained, humiliated, and assaulted, without cause, on 2 separate occasions. Once they knew who I was, they let me go. But when they didn't recognize me, they assumed I was a criminal. So, tell me, what exactly was misunderstood?" A murmur rippled through the gallery, low but unmistakable. The defense attorney pressed his lips together, regrouping. "Would you say the officers were simply following standard procedure?" Jamal's eyes darkened slightly. "Standard procedure does not include punching a restrained man in the face," he said coolly. "Standard procedure does not include fabricating a reason for a stop after the fact. Standard procedure does not include assuming guilt before an ID is even checked." He leaned forward slightly, his voice unwavering. "So, no, Counselor, this was not standard procedure. This was racism." A sharp inhale from someone in the gallery. The defense attorney hesitated, then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. No further questions. Jamal leaned back slightly, watching as Morrison and Reed finally, fully absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Their own lawyer had given up, and this was just the beginning, because soon the jury would decide their fate, and this time the law would not be on their side. Morrison and Reed sat at the defense table, their once confident postures now rigid, their expressions frozen somewhere between barely contained panic and forced control. They had spent their careers believing they were untouchable, that the law would always bend in their favor, that they would always be the ones sitting in judgment rather than the ones being judged. But now, stripped of their badges, their authority, their certainty, they sat before a jury that had seen every damning second of footage, that had heard every brutal detail laid out with cold, unflinching precision, and they knew the tide had turned against them. The defense attorney, an older man with sharp, calculating eyes and a voice that had likely persuaded juries in the past stood from his chair, buttoning his jacket with slow, practiced movements, projecting the kind of confidence that suggested there was still a battle to be fought, still a narrative to be reshaped, still a way out if only they could make the jury see what they wanted them to see. He exhaled slowly, stepping toward the witness stand where Morrison now sat, his face carefully composed, though his fingers twitched slightly where they rested on the table in front of him, a small tell that betrayed the storm roiling beneath the surface. "Officer Morrison," the attorney began, his voice smooth, measured, carefully neutral, "you and Officer Reed have been accused of racially profiling and wrongfully detaining the plaintiff, Judge Jamal Carter. You've been accused of excessive force, of violating protocol, of assault. Do you believe these allegations reflect the truth of what happened that night?" Morrison shook his head immediately, his movements sharp, deliberate, the reflex of a man who had spent years justifying every action, every decision, every stop, every arrest of a man who had never once questioned whether he was in the wrong. "No," he said, his voice clipped, tense, but controlled. "Absolutely not." The defense attorney nodded slightly, as if satisfied with the response. "Then let's start from the beginning. In your own words, describe why you and Officer Reed stopped Judge Carter that night." Morrison licked his lips briefly, glancing toward the jury before straightening his posture, as if trying to reclaim some sense of authority, some sense that he was still the one in control of this situation. "We noticed a vehicle that fit the description of a stolen car from earlier that week," he said, his tone carefully even, as though he were explaining something routine, something reasonable, something any good officer would have done. "It was a high-end rental, no plates visible from our angle. The driver seemed nervous." Jamal let out a sharp, quiet laugh. Morrison flinched, his gaze snapping toward him, the briefest flicker of irritation flashing across his face, before he schooled his expression back into something impassive. Jamal leaned back slightly, shaking his head. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That's the best you've got?" The prosecutor didn't intervene. She didn't have to, because the jury was watching Morrison now, waiting for him to explain how he had managed to arrest the same man twice in a week, and still convince himself it wasn't racial profiling. Morrison inhaled sharply through his nose, looking back toward the defense attorney, his jaw tight. "As I was saying," he continued, his voice just a little stiffer now, "we noticed a vehicle that matched the description of a stolen rental. We initiated a traffic stop, and at that point, the driver—" "Me!" Jamal interjected smoothly. Morrison's hands clenched slightly before he forced himself to ignore the interruption, became uncooperative. He refused to provide identification, refused to exit the vehicle when instructed. At that point, we had reason to suspect he was attempting to evade law enforcement, which escalated the situation. The prosecutor finally leaned forward slightly in her chair, folding her hands together, her expression calm but sharp, her voice laced with just enough disbelief to cut through Morrison's carefully rehearsed lines. "So, Officer Morrison, let me get this straight," she said, her tone slow, deliberate, every word carrying the weight of undeniable contradiction. "You pulled over a black man in a rental car and immediately suspected it was stolen, even though you had no evidence to confirm that. You demanded he exit the vehicle before even checking his credentials. And when he asked why he was being stopped, you considered that, what, exactly, suspicious behavior?" Morrison's jaw twitched, his hands flexing slightly before settling once more. "We followed standard procedure." The prosecutor let the words sit in the air for a moment, let the sheer audacity of them stretch between them before she nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "Standard procedure." She turned toward the jury, letting the phrase linger, letting them think about what those words really meant, about what they had seen in the video, about the punches thrown, the bruises left, the rage behind every shove, every insult. Then she turned back to Morrison. "Tell me, Officer Morrison, What part of standard procedure involves telling a restrained man that he's a nobody? Morrison stiffened. The gallery shifted. The quiet weight of the moment palpable, unrelenting. You think we remember every little thing that happens during an arrest? Morrison snapped, the frustration finally cracking through his carefully controlled exterior, the mask slipping just enough for everyone in the room to see what was underneath. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his voice low, deadly. Oh, you don't remember? Morrison's lips pressed together, his shoulders rigid. Jamal's voice remained calm, but every word was deliberate, slow, sharp enough to cut. You don't remember telling me I was just another loudmouth punk? You don't remember slamming me against the car hard enough that I could feel my ribs bruise? You don't remember laughing when you said my phone might just stop working once it got to evidence? You don't remember, huh? Morrison didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. The prosecutor leaned back in her chair, nodding once as if she had just made the point she wanted to make. No further questions. Morrison sat stiffly, his hands clenched, his breathing shallow, his gaze flicking briefly toward Reed, who looked just as pale, just as shaken, just as lost. The judge turned toward the defense attorney. Would you like to call Officer Reed to testify? A long pause. The attorney looked at Reed. Reed, for the first time since the trial had begun, shook his head. The defense attorney exhaled sharply. No, Your Honor. Jamal let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. This was it. This was the moment they finally understood. Morrison stared at the table, his fingers curled into fists, his shoulders rigid, unyielding, but powerless. Reed was even worse, his breath unsteady, his body betraying him with every slight shift, every tremor in his fingers, every sharp exhale. They had come into this trial thinking they could talk their way out of it, that if they twisted the narrative enough, they could bend reality to their will the way they always had before. But they weren't officers anymore. They were defendants, and soon the jury would decide exactly what that meant. The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy with anticipation, a kind of stillness that only came when something monumental was about to happen. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and though the wait had been expected, the tension had remained unbroken, stretching across the room like an unspoken weight, pressing down on every person seated within. The reporters had long since stopped whispering, their notepads filled with speculation, their cameras trained on the double doors at the back of the room, waiting for the moment they would swing open and signal the final chapter of this trial. The gallery, packed with members of the public who had followed the case with unwavering attention, sat silent, their eyes locked on the empty jury box, their hands gripping the arms of their seats, as though bracing for the moment the scales would finally tip. At the defense table, Morrison and Reed sat unmoving, their expressions unreadable, though it was clear from the stiffness of their shoulders, the way their fingers curled slightly against the table's surface, that they were anything but calm. They had spent the last few hours in a silent prison of their own making, waiting for a verdict that they both knew had already been decided before the deliberation had even begun. The evidence had been damning, the footage inescapable, the weight of their actions undeniable. There had been no way to twist it, no loophole to escape through, no technicality to latch onto in the hopes of walking away unscathed. And now, as the double doors finally swung open and the 12 jurors filed in, their expressions grave, their movements steady but deliberate, that truth settled over them like an iron weight, suffocating in its finality. All rise. The judge's voice rang clear, steady, commanding, and in unison, the room obeyed. The collective shuffle of chairs scraping against the floor, the only sound breaking the silence. Jamal stood with the rest, his posture relaxed but unyielding, his gaze fixed on the foreperson as she stepped forward, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hands, her expression betraying nothing of what was written on it. She handed it to the bailiff, who, in turn, passed it to the judge. The moment stretched, elongated by the weight of what was about to be spoken into reality. Jamal exhaled slowly, deliberately, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his breathing measured, controlled, waiting. The judge unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning its contents, her face impassive, unreadable, before she lifted her gaze, leveling it at the two men seated before her. In the case of the United States versus Officers Morrison and Reed, on the charge of excessive force, we find the defendants guilty. The words landed like a hammer. Final. Absolute. Reverberating through the room with a force that no one dared to interrupt. Jamal barely blinked. The judge continued, her voice unwavering, delivering each charge with the same steady authority, ensuring that there would be no room for doubt, no space for argument. On the charge of unlawful detainment, we find the defendants guilty. Morrison flinched, just slightly, his hands tightening into fists against the table, his breathing suddenly shallower, less controlled, as though the reality of what was happening was finally beginning to crash down upon him in a way that could not be ignored. Reed had gone rigid, his eyes locked forward, his lips pressed into a thin line. But the way his fingers twitched against his lap, the way his throat worked as he swallowed against a dry mouth, told a different story. They were feeling it now. Every mistake, every misstep, every decision they had made in the name of authority, every moment they had spent believing they were invincible, untouchable, above consequence, it had all led them here. The judge didn't pause, didn't soften, didn't waver. On the charge of violating the civil rights of the plaintiff, we find the defendants guilty. The gallery erupted. There was no stopping it this time, no silencing the collective exhale of relief, the surge of emotion that had been held in for too long. Some gasped. Others let out sharp exhales. A few muttered quiet words under their breath. But the energy in the room shifted, something long overdue settling into place, something that had been denied too many times before, now finally standing firm. The judge let the reaction breathe for only a moment before lifting her hand. The murmurs died down, the room settling once more, though the tension had not disappeared. It had simply transformed, no longer thick with uncertainty, but with the gravity of what would come next. Morrison and Reed sat frozen, their bodies rigid, their faces unreadable, though the pale cast to Reed's skin and the way Morrison's jaw flexed told the truth of what they were feeling far louder than any words ever could. Jamal remained still, watching, absorbing, letting the moment stretch deep into his bones, committing it to memory, because this was justice. The judge exhaled, setting the paper down before shifting her gaze toward the defendants. This court has considered the evidence presented, has reviewed the details of this case with the full weight of the law, and has determined that the actions taken by the defendants were not only unlawful, but a blatant abuse of power, a violation of the very duty they swore to uphold. In light of these convictions, it is the ruling of this court that Officers Morrison and Reed shall be sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, effective immediately. The room snapped. There was no containing the reaction this time, no controlled murmurs, no quiet nods of acknowledgement. This was a moment in history, and everyone present knew it. Morrison let out a sharp breath, his hands slamming onto the table, his face contorting in disbelief, his mouth opening like he wanted to argue, to protest, to deny, but there was nothing left to say. Reed looked even worse, his expression shell-shocked, his eyes darting wildly as though looking for an exit, a lifeline, a way to undo what had just happened. But there was none. The bailiffs stepped forward, their movements precise, practiced, professional, their presence removing whatever illusion of control the two men had left. Jamal watched as the handcuffs were secured around their wrists, as their shoulders stiffened, as the full weight of what had just happened settled into their bones. They had come into this trial expecting to walk away, expecting the system to bend in their favor as it always had before. expecting the rules that had shielded them their entire careers to hold firm once more. But now, as they were led away, their suits wrinkled, their heads bowed, their names forever tied to the weight of their crimes, they finally understood. They would not be walking away this time. There would be no escaping it, no undoing it, no quiet reassignment, no career to return to. They were finished, and Jamal, standing at the edge of the room, his shoulders relaxed, his breath steady, finally felt free. This was not the end of the fight. There would be others, more cases, more names, more battles that still needed to be fought. But today, the law had worked. And that was something worth remembering. The courthouse steps were packed. A sea of people gathered outside, the energy in the air thick with something far greater than celebration, something deeper, something that had been held back for too long, something that had simmered beneath the surface of too many trials, where justice had never been served, where verdicts had been twisted, where accountability had slipped through the cracks of a system designed to protect itself. But not this time. Jamal stepped through the heavy wooden doors, his posture steady, his movements unhurried as he emerged into the open air. The weight that had settled in his chest for the past weeks, months, years finally lifting in a way that felt foreign, unfamiliar, but welcome all the same. The sunlight caught on the cameras flashing in every direction, journalists scrambling to get into position, microphones thrust forward, voices rising in an attempt to cut through the crowd, each one desperate to capture the moment as it unfolded. He had expected this. He had known, from the moment the gavel had come down, that this case was never just about him, never just about Morrison and Reed, never just about a single traffic stop or a single instance of misconduct. This had become something larger, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom, something that had taken root in the conversations happening across the country, in the protests that had ignited outside the station the night of his second arrest, in the demands for reform that had grown louder with every headline, every broadcast, every moment that the world had been forced to watch what had happened to him and see, without question, the truth of it. Judge Carter, do you believe this case will set a precedent for future police accountability? The question came from a reporter at the front of the crowd, her eyes sharp, her microphone extended, waiting for a response. Others echoed similar inquiries, overlapping voices pushing for answers, eager to frame this as something definitive, as if a single case could dismantle what had been built over centuries. Jamal exhaled, his lips pressing together briefly before he stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying the full weight of what he knew needed to be said. "This verdict is a step," he said, his gaze moving over the gathered press, his words measured, deliberate. "It is a victory in this case, for this moment, for this truth that could not be ignored. But accountability is not justice. It is the bare minimum of what should be expected in a system that claims to serve and protect. It is not enough to convict two men when the culture that allowed them to operate without consequence still exists. If today has shown us anything, it's that the system is capable of working, but only when it is forced to do so." The murmurs grew louder, the cameras still rolling, capturing every second, knowing that his words would be dissected, debated, analyzed across every media outlet before the day was over. "Do you believe more officers should be investigated?" another reporter asked, pushing forward. Jamal's expression remained impassive, his voice steady. "I believe this case has exposed a reality that many have tried to ignore. Morrison and Reed weren't anomalies. They weren't a case of a few bad apples. They were the product of a culture that has excused, defended, and protected these behaviors for decades. And if you're asking whether more should be held accountable, then my question to you is, how many more videos do you need before that answer is obvious?" Silence settled over the crowd for a brief moment before another voice cut through. "What happens now?" Jamal inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle, letting himself absorb the weight of the question. Because that was what mattered the most, not what had already happened, not the convictions, not the spectacle of it all, but what would come next. What would be done now that the door had been forced open? Now, he said, his voice resolute. We keep going. The cameras continued flashing, the questions still flying from every direction. But Jamal had already said what needed to be said. He stepped back, moving toward the car waiting at the curb, the driver already holding the door open, ready to take him away from the chaos, from the spectacle of it all. But before he slid inside, he turned his head slightly, casting one last glance back toward the courthouse, toward the pillars that had once stood as a symbol of an institution that had failed too many times to count, toward the doors that had, for once, opened to something closer to justice. And then he stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, the world still buzzing outside, the movement still happening, the fight still far from over, because this was just the beginning. And he wasn't finished yet. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.